Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for June 6th, 2025. It was 81 years ago today that the Allied invasion of Normandy was launched, so-called D-Day, spelling the coming end of the Third Reich. It occurred in the context of an already retreating German army from Russia. And though there was still a lot of fighting ahead, this was definitely a turning point as Allies landed tens of thousands of troops in Normandy beaches and moved eastward to take on the retreating German forces. Now, today we're reaching a turning point again in a strategic situation that's rich in drama. Crises everywhere. War and chaos, bringing with it famine and disease, the sweet dream, you might say, of the Malthusians who wish to reduce the world's population. But at the same time, the potential to end these wars is real. Just in the last days alone, President Trump spoke with Putin and spoke with President Xi of China at precisely a point of the heating up of the crisis over Ukraine with the Ukrainian strikes against the Russian airfields. Now, all of this, as I say, is rich in drama. You also have the Musk-Trump fallout, which may be not quite as big a story as the media is trying to make it. The continuing story of the end of the Biden regime and so on. So we have a situation with all kinds of events going on, and it prompted a couple of very serious, good questions. So let me take the two questions since it's Friday and we take your questions on Fridays. First one from the United States, and it's a simple one. Have we learned nothing from World War II? And this is after going through what the Europeans are doing and saying they're preparing for war with Russia, the seemingly support for the Nazis by not acknowledging the victory in Europe Day by the leaders in Europe and so on. So the question is, how do you do something where they've not learned the lessons? Well, we have to be very clear. And the way LaRouche always addressed this was to say, address the causes of war. And the causes of war are not simple at all, but they're multiply connected. But the origin in modern history, it comes from greed, imperial arrogance, geopolitical ideology, in statecraft and economics. The idea of a zero-sum game, that if I don't win, you win. The idea that there's no way to increase the economic pie for everyone, and therefore you have to get a bigger piece for yourself. And this is backed up by the idea of might makes right. Now, there was an attempt to change this after World War II, what Franklin Roosevelt insisted on that the United Nations should be, which was a place where nations could come with grievances, could come for dialogue, can work through problems. That was the idea of the United Nations. And for a little bit of time, it seemed to be working. But especially after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we saw the emergence in the United States of a geopolitical strategy that came directly from London. And in fact, it was transmitted from the City of London through Wall Street, financial houses, and law firms. And so the United States essentially took over the role of empire from the British. Now, and that, by the way, had a lot to do with the killing of John F. Kennedy. The period after that was, the turning point was the 1971 decision by Nixon to move toward a speculative economy by ending the reserve basis of the dollar and removing the dollar from a gold connection, getting rid of the connection between gold and currency. And so it opened the door for speculation, for a casino economy. And what that meant is that nations that were still striving for development, the so-called third world countries, were hit by a brick wall called the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF insisted that debt payment comes first, that they're not going to allocate funds for development. And as a result, you had a decision made from the advanced sector to extend the looting of the poorer countries through a free trade policy. That included exporting jobs. It included the idea of structural adjustments, the idea of zero tolerance for countries running deficits, and so on. And the result has been the fact that no nations are developing. Now, that led to internal crises in the global south, and now we're seeing a reassertion of what was coming up with the non-aligned movement, which is a reassertion of sovereignty, of the right of nations to defend their own standard of living for their people and to use their resources to do that. And so we have a confrontation in the world. The confrontation is, what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. It should be easily solvable. There's no reason to build up Ukraine as a nuclear NATO country against Russia. Why is that being done? In opposition to what Russia is doing with China to create the BRICS alliance. That what we're seeing from Russia and China, with India also, is a recognition that you need strength to carry out an economic reorganization or an economic reform. And what's the nature of the reform? Breaking out of the zero-sum game of predatory exploitation by the Western nations using their militaries to enforce it. And so instead of a zero-sum game, China is promoting what they call win-win relationship, based on the idea of acting for the benefit of the other. The idea that development, the idea that not just any kind of development, for example, not solar energy development, but advances in technology, especially energy-intensive technology. That's the way you create development. And that's not the policy of the IMF. And so a lot of these crises stem from this battle for controlling resources, terms of trade, the balance of payments, and so on. The best way to deal with that is economic development. Invest in the real economy. But that was more or less outlawed after 1971, especially in the developing sector, but increasingly in the so-called advanced sector. And as a result, we have the confrontation we have in Ukraine, we have the situation in Southwest Asia, we have threats in the Indo-Pacific region to charge against China. And this has nothing to do with anything the Chinese, the Russians are doing. It has to do with their insistence that there be an order in which sovereignty is recognized and sovereign nations collaborate for economic benefit for all of them. That's the cause of these crises. Now, put that together with the next question, which was from a Canadian contact who said, I was disgusted by seeing His Satanic Majesty King Charles sitting on a throne in the Canadian Parliament. Now Mark Carney, he writes, has joined with Starmer, Macron, and Merz, preparing for war with Russia. Do the people of Europe want war? That's the question. Well, I think you know the answer. Outside of the people you mentioned, Starmer, Merz, and others, who want war because that's what their puppet masters put them in office to do, outside of them, most people don't want war. Europe was the scene of two major wars in the 20th century, wars that depopulated whole sections of Europe. World War I in particular was a meat grinder. Do the people want wars? No, of course not. But you know what? They don't even know that they may be involved in a war. Here you have Merz, the new Chancellor of Germany, threatening to send long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine to hit deep inside Russia, making Germany a target for the Russians, as the Russians are saying if any missiles hit, any Taurus missiles hit from Ukraine into Russia, we'll know it's the Brits that did it. So what we're seeing is an enticement for war. Now, there are some who say that's exactly what they want, what the Europeans want. They want that war. Because as Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. War is a chance to make huge amounts of money through military production and so on. But who benefits from that? The establishment, not the people. And so when you ask the question, do the Europeans want war, the question really should be, what can they do to stop a war? And what's needed now is a mobilization in the streets against the policies of the City of London, of Wall Street, of the British establishment. And that the alternative is collaboration for mutual self-development. Now, we have a whole program on this. LaRouche has written volumes on this. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has taken this up as the real point of the Schiller Institute organizing. So I'd encourage you to go to the LaRouche organization website and look at some of these documents, or go to the LaRouche publications, the Executive Intelligence Review, and find out what Lyndon LaRouche had to say over the last 50 years about how development can bring about peace. And then recognize that that means you have a responsibility. You can't sit back and let the war hawks play. And that responsibility is to support the LaRouche movement and our ideas. And then I'll have some of these linked in the description section below. Hopefully, as we see these crises deepen, you'll get the idea. The answer to these crises, the solution, is the people. That's you, acting in your self-interest to bring nations together around a strategy of expanded productivity, increased productivity based on the introduction of new scientific principles through technology in the industrial process. That's always been the solution. When it gets turned away from that, that's when we have war. So thanks for joining us this week. Please take advantage of the material we're posting at the LaRouche Organization and the SchillerInstitute.com, and join us over the next weeks to make this a period where we put an end to war and create the basis for a new paradigm and a new security and development.